still passionately engaging.
At the same time, it seems to me that
All right. Welcome to Science-Based Choices for Climate Action. I hope you've joined us for some previous sessions. I do recognize a number of you as having been attending multiple sessions of the symposium. We also have a virtual audience as well. Welcome to you. We are going to be taking questions at some point during this session, so start thinking now about questions that you might ask, particularly our students here at Dickinson College. Start forming those questions. You'll get an opportunity to ask them soon. If you're watching this virtually, watching the live stream, you can type questions into the chat on YouTube Live. You can do that at any point. We'll be watching there, looking for your questions to pass to the moderator. We have, should we have an emergency here, we've got an exit off to my left on this side. We've got exits at the top right and left at the back of the room, and then there's another exit this way behind me. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator for this session, Professor Forrest Watson. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and welcome to everyone. As you said, my name is Forrest Watson, and I'm one of the newest faculty members here at Dickinson College. It's been an honor to join an institution that hosts this kind of a symposium, and when I was looking at job options, it was really attractive to come to an institution like this that has an emphasis on sustainability. The last 11 years, I've been living and working overseas, and I want to extend a special welcome to my colleagues joining from Turkey, where I was. It was great to work on many sustainability-related projects together, and welcome to everyone online. It's been so great to see people from the Global South able to join the conference here. I teach in the International Business and Management department here at the college, and it's really important to us as a department that we're training business students and future practitioners to care about sustainable business and enterprise. One of the academic areas in which I work is in macro marketing, and macro marketers care about how does marketing and the markets influence society. So we care about complex problems. We care about developing these types of solutions. In my work, too, I also study consumer behavior, and many panels so far the last few days have mentioned about the importance of behavior change and how the actions, the choices of consumers are going to make an impact on this issue of climate change. As my family and I were moving to Carlisle just this summer, one of the consumer choices I was aware of was the choice on where we're going to live. And as Karen really articulated well yesterday in the session on cities and climate change, she talked about the importance, the choice of where we live compared to where we work and where we play. And, wrestling through that, how close do I want to live to where I work? And it's a real privilege to be in a place like Carlisle where it's easy to be able to walk and bike to work. And as someone interested in consumer behavior, I think about how the aggregation of all of those consumer choices on, for example, what house we might buy, are going to have a big impact on the climate. So that's a little bit about myself and the background I have and the interest I have in sustainability and climate change. And I now want to open things up to our fabulous panel. And if you all could introduce yourselves briefly and share just some of the highlights of how your career has been about these transformations and how they influence the climate. Rachel, you can start us off.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Rachel Cleetus, and I'm the Policy Director for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm an economist by training and have really, for my entire career, worked in kind of an interdisciplinary space around this vexing challenge of climate change. Just in terms of a little background, I came to this work very much as a data geek, an energy geek who cares about how we transform our energy systems. I focus a lot of my work on power sector transformations. And when I first started doing this work, I was overly enamored of models and what models could show around deep decarbonization. I still love those models. I still love the data geekery and have come to the realization after all this time that data tells you part of the story, but it's what's outside the models that matters equally. So thinking about the climate challenge is not just a challenge of carbon emissions in the atmosphere, or even about how we power our homes and our cars. It is about all those things. But if we're going to meet global climate goals, it's really important to recognize the social science aspects of this. And embedded deeply in the climate challenge is an equity challenge, because it's not just about carbon in the atmosphere, it's about who has had the right and the privilege to emit that carbon and has taken up that carbon space in the atmosphere. Meanwhile, we have many millions of people around the world who don't even have access to modern forms of energy and are feeling the brunt of climate impacts that are acutely expressed around the world. I mean, just this year, we've seen these devastating floods in Pakistan, floods in Nigeria, heat waves, wildfires, storms. There is a looming famine in the Horn of Africa right now. Many people at risk of hunger, including many millions of children. Most of those people have contributed practically nothing to the carbon emissions. Very much a majority of the responsibility is on richer nations like the United States that is singularly responsible for about a quarter of cumulative heat trapping emissions. So when we talk about transformative change, we really have to think about this as both an equity challenge as well as a techno challenge, and we have to look beyond carbon. And in my own work, have started to think about the connections between how fossil fuels, the root causes of our fossil fuel dependence, go back to the ways in which we've marginalized and dumped pollution on certain communities and certain people here in the United States as well as around the world. And as we think about solutions to cut carbon emissions, let's think about centering those people who've been on the margins now bearing the brunt. Solutions that really work for them, providing access to clean energy, affordable energy, energy justice, climate resilience investments in these places where it's desperately needed. So I guess for me, this work is very much about solving the climate challenge in an equitable way with justice firmly centered in that frame. And thank you so much for having me here today.
Great. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you. Sivan, let's turn to you. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sivan Kartha. I'm a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is, we're headquartered in Stockholm, but we're a global organization. We have an office in the Boston area attached to Tufts University, another office in Seattle, another in Davis, and then another 7 or so offices around the world. And I'm research director of our Equitable Transitions program. And like Rachel, my training is in physics, but in a similar technical quantitative bent. I was lucky that I had a formative advisor, Kurt Gottfried, who it turns out also founded the Union of Concerned Scientists, the organization that Rachel works with. And I was a teaching assistant for him in a class called War and Peace in the Nuclear Age. And it was an absolutely fascinating class. And nuclear proliferation and disarmament and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Daniel Ellsberg, who as an act of conscience had leaked the Pentagon Papers, was one of our guest speakers. And it just made such a striking impression on me of how technical quantitative work can be used, not just to solve kind of fun physics puzzles, but to deal with important global problems. And so Professor Gottfried, he kind of introduced me to the field of people who are doing this type of work, using technical analysis and quantitative work to deal with major global problems. And so that's how I shifted from doing a PhD in physics to working on technologies first, like renewables, and then climate change generally, and for much of the last 10, 15 years, a big part of that work for me has been focused on the equity dimensions around climate change, and so that's what I tend to talk about when I talk about climate change, is the equity dimensions around it.
Thank you, Sivan. It's nice to hear about the impactful advisor too, and how that got you into this work. And I also feel indebted to my advisor as well. So thanks for reminding us of those people who have gotten us going in this direction. Thank you. Gabriel, could you introduce yourself? Thanks for joining us from Argentina today.
No, thank you, Forrest, for this invitation, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure for me. I'm a full-time professor, a researcher at the National University of the Center in Argentina, and I work here in Argentina, where I am now in a research group dealing with mainly energy scenarios. And so we've been working on developing different kind of energy scenarios with different goals and different purposes. And what we are doing, perhaps, to make the work a little bit different, is just to add these different layers of information to those scenarios, not just the technical part of the scenarios, or even the economic part, but other layers of information more related to social and environmental aspects. So what are the impacts of those scenarios in different social and environmental aspects? So this is what I do, or what we do here for the last several years. And I also work, in the IPCC. I work in the AR5, IPCC assessment report, and now in the AR6, very long cycle of the IPCC, and mainly work on the mitigation part, but not only, but mitigation involves many things, and so when I say mitigation, maybe it sounds a little bit narrow, but it's actually quite broad. So or at least this is what we try to do, or I try to push, even in the IPCC discussions. So a pleasure to be here, and happy to participate in the coming hour. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Gabriel. It's wonderful to have a panel that has so much experience working with IPCC, so thank you. Next, I wanted to ask each of you if you'd be willing to share one of the transformations about which you're most passionate. We're talking today about the social, economic, and technological transformations towards a zero carbon future. Would you each be willing to pick one of those transformations that most occupies you? Rachel, why don't you begin again?
Sure, I'd be happy to start. So on the transformative side of the energy system, I spend a lot of time thinking about the power sector in particular. And the power sector is really a fantastic place to think about how this transformation can work, not just to make our electricity more low carbon, but also because the power sector ends up being the linchpin for transforming other sectors of the economy. What I mean by that is all of the deep decarbonization studies show that you have to cut power sector emissions, and there are many ready technologies available to do that. Renewable energy, energy storage, building the transmission to support integrating more renewable energy, off-grid technologies, et cetera. But then decarbonizing the power sector has to simultaneously be accompanied by electrifying as much as you can across the economy in the vehicle sector, transit, buildings, industry. And that's how you get to this world of net zero, by working across, breaking down these sectoral silos with the power sector as kind of a linchpin. Energy efficiency is obviously a big piece of this puzzle as well, not just how we use energy, but making sure that as little of it as possible is being used. When I think about this work, and last year I had the chance to publish some research with an advisory committee that included several folks with an equity lens. And one of the things we challenged ourselves to do is, yes, modeling to show what's possible in the power sector and across the economy, but also think about how you would get to those changes. And what we found is that in our policy recommendations, that all of these changes become more impactful and you have more opportunities when you think beyond carbon. Fossil fuels are polluting. They're literally killing people right now because of criteria air pollutants, conventional pollutants like particulate matter. And making this shift delivers a lot of near-term public health benefits. It also specifically delivers benefits to environmental justice communities that are currently very much overburdened by pollution. So thinking about those dimensions allows you to imagine a world where you're not just addressing carbon emissions from the power sector, but also trying to set right these long-standing injustices, environmental injustices, which in the US are very much connected to racial injustice. The other piece was recognizing that as you make this transformation, there are currently communities that are dependent on fossil fuels for their livelihoods, coal communities, for example. And to do this in a way that's fair, we can't just leave people behind, people who've helped keep the lights on for generations. So we have to center the fact that there needs to be a just transition for these communities, for these workers, as we're moving to these cleaner forms of energy. So essentially, we came up with a framework that we called a people-centered framework for transformative change that took the emphasis off just technologies and carbon emissions and put it on people and daily life pocketbook issues, public health, affordable energy, jobs. And that's the frame in which we offered recommendations for transformative change.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And I hope later we'll get to hear a little bit more about some of those people-centered focus on clean energy transition. So thank you. Sivan, let's go back to you. What's one transformation that you particularly care about?
I think of this as more of a transformation, a political transformation, or a transformation in perspective. And I kind of link my starting to think about this again with a sort of a formative mentor. Bu Shelin is he was the head of delegation for the Swedish delegation to the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, and that was really an incredibly important point in international environmental governance. That's where the climate treaty was signed. That's where the treaty to combat desertification was signed. That's where the biodiversity treaty was signed. And it put forward sustainable development as this shared global effort because the problems are global. We kind of matured there beyond thinking of environmental problems as being local things that we deal with within our own communities or countries, or sometimes with our neighbors, and you can kind of think of acid rain or polluted water bodies as that kind of a problem. But we were realizing, no, problems like climate change, problems like biodiversity, even desertification, these are not really national problems. These are global problems, and we have to treat them as global problems. And we have to deal with them cooperatively. And that idea of dealing cooperatively with environmental problems immediately brings in the notion of equity. And the Rio Declaration itself, as well as those three treaties under the Rio Declaration, they explicitly kind of commit countries to cooperating on the basis of equity. And that was a momentous transformation. And I remember Boucheline telling me that they came out of Rio and they had this sense like, we've turned a corner. We've made such an important step here, kind of, locked arms and went out together saying, we're going to, we've changed the culture around international attempts to deal with environmental problems. And yes, that may have been the seed, but it sure has taken a long time to germinate. And indeed, there's even been, backsliding. In other words, that transformation is still in process. Negotiations in the climate negotiations have gotten much more contentious. It's come more to resemble the hardball negotiations of a trade treaty, the WTO, that kind of thing. The U.S. was caught spying on its own allies in Copenhagen, and developed countries have, kind of been using accounting tricks to make it seem like they're fulfilling their commitments to provide support to poor countries when they're not really. And in 2014, I think, at another one of these international negotiations, in Poland, I ran across, walking through the streets of Poznan, Poland, late at night after the negotiating sessions were over, and I ran into a friend who had been advising the small island states, and she just looked absolutely despondent. She explained she'd just come out of negotiations where the developed countries acting as a bloc had done this kind of end run around the small island states with regard to providing support because they sure are in need of it. And she, being an international lawyer, was doing what she could to stop this. But to a large degree, this subtle maneuver, the small island states, they weren't even aware of what was going on. She used the term roadkill, which was, it's a depressing view of how negotiations go, but it speaks to the fact that this is a transformation from going into these kind of negotiations looking to maximize sort of national near-term interest to going into these negotiations thinking of these as global problems that we have to respond to cooperatively, and that requires doing it on the basis of equity. And on the basis of equity, there's sort of the ethical reasons for doing things in a fair way, but there's also the political reasons. There's also the sort of the instrumental value of equity, which is that if you want to solve a problem that really takes cooperation, then it has to seem like something that is fair to the countries who you need to be involved. And so trying to understand what other countries think of as fair, what they would consider fair, what they would consider, an acceptable basis on which to cooperate with your country, then that's the only way that negotiations can really come to meaningful outcomes. And, this has been recognized in the IPCC, which has explicitly said that agreements that have the buy-in of countries, because they're seen as fair, tend to be more successful agreements. Surprise, surprise. So that transition to thinking more about these problems as things that need to be solved cooperatively rather than as zero-sum negotiations like others often are thought of, it's a critical transformation that is still happening. One bit of progress that I see that's encouraging is that notion has been internalized more by NGOs and by the climate movement in general. The importance of fairness, both in terms of sort of international fairness between countries and what different countries should do, and also domestic fairness, the importance of justice at the local level, and making sure that companies feel like communities feel like they're they're being, treated okay, and this is a law I can get behind. This is a climate response I can get behind. And I think the environmental movement for too long has been a little cavalier about that, and has been willing to say too easily, "Oh, we've got technologies that'll deal with that," and renewables are nice and clean, and they'll provide net job increases. But net job increases is all well and good, unless you're on the negative side of the net, and you're one of the people who loses your job when people around you may be getting jobs. So taking seriously what are the distributional consequences of our responses to environmental problems at the domestic scale and at the international scale it's absolutely critical to solving the problems, and it's a transformation that we're still sort of maturing through.
Great, Sivan, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing this sobering experience that you had, but then also bringing in the optimism of that moment in 1992 in Rio. And in an earlier session today, we were talking about environmental history as well. And it's great, I think, for many of our students who weren't alive in 1992 to hear about those kinds of moments where there is an optimism we can make a difference. And I think in what you shared, you see both sides of that, the optimism, but then also the need for greater equity in the process. Let's turn to Gabriel. Could you share about one transformation that you would like to see?
Yeah, of course. Let me start saying that we definitely need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. No questions about that. But the path to reach that goal should be as important as the goal itself. What I'm trying to say is that that pathway should be a sustainable one, right? In harmony with natural resources, with ecosystem services, so a sustainable pathway in a profound way of the word sustainable. So if we are going to reach that net zero emissions, creating other social or environmental problems in the way, so what is the fun of doing that, right? What is the gain? So I usually say that we need to think twice, or maybe more, before moving in one direction, or before running after magical technologies that are coming to save us, right? So we need to ask to ourselves in the first place, what am I doing this for, right? And then, how am I going to do this? So I think that we are in trouble. It's going to be difficult if we believe that climate change is about developing and implementing new technologies. This is what I think. I think that climate change, as we all know, is a result of living outside the cost-benefit analysis, all natural resources and all ecosystem services for more than 2 centuries. And climate change is an externality, as the economists like to say, but it's not the only one. It's not the only one. So we can mention other hundreds of externalities that we created in the last 2 centuries. Oceans being contaminated, rivers, land, etc. Right? So what I think as a transformation that we need is a transformation that align our development with the planet where we live, right? So if we try to match a linear, even exponential, development with a cyclical planet, but then good luck. So this is the kind of transformation I would like to see. It's not just a carbon-centric kind of thing, reducing emission no matter what. That is not what I'm thinking of, or what I would like to see. So I would like to stop here because I know that maybe you have some other questions to ask or to some other comments, but this is the kind of things I would like to say. It's not just about climate change. It's deeper than that. It's much more profound. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Gabriel. And I wanted to just ask in follow-up, can you share more specifically about what are some of the trade-offs that are a reality as we pursue sustainable development?
Well, that's interesting because sometimes, we sort of think about the future full of new technologies, and then we analyze what are the synergies that those technologies can create with other sustainable development goals other than climate change. And so synergies and trade-offs. And of course, we need to think about that, but not in the latest stage of the analysis. This is what usually do, even in the IPCC. We have a number of chapters talking about the beautiful of the new technologies, and then at the very end comes the trade-off analysis of those. And I can mention just a couple of examples, very clear ones, almost obvious for everyone. One is bioenergy, right? So this bioenergy, the biomass used as a feedstock for producing bioenergy of different kinds, right? What are we doing there? What are we thinking about the new and even greater environmental and social impacts of producing this biomass? So that depends on how you produce that biomass for bioenergy. Is it soybean, for instance, to produce biodiesel? Is that soybean grown supported by agrochemicals that we are talking about? So biofuel is fantastic, biodiesel is fantastic, yeah, but the agrochemical is in our land. And we breathe those agrochemicals every single day for others to run it or to drive a car with biodiesel in the fuel tank. So these are the kind of a trade-off that we need to. Another example, the batteries for electric mobility, right? Those batteries that use lithium and cobalt. Are we thinking about? Do we have any idea what the mining of lithium and cobalt are doing in lands, pristine landscape, for instance, in my country, or in Africa, or in other places of the world? So, are we running? This is a new rush, the rush of electric mobility, and we are running, behind that new technology. So the point is perhaps to again, stop for a little while, think twice, think what are we doing this for, and how I'm going to do this. Again, two same questions as I posed before. So these are the kind of thinking that we need to start integrating every time we think in a transformation, in a future, in a sustainable future.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gabriel. So talking about the issue of trade-offs, we're in the midst of a Senate race here in the state of Pennsylvania. And last night there was a televised debate between the two candidates that maybe some of you tuned into. One of the questions that was asked was about fracking, and both of the candidates last night stated their support for fracking, for the extraction of natural gas and oil from the earth. And in that question, there's obviously a tension over the economics in the state. And Sivan, you mentioned the important, consideration of jobs and the economy and the people who are on that negative side of the net trade-offs. Could you comment on that? How do you think governments and the population should be thinking about government policies and actions related to a technology like fracking?
I think we are actually incredibly lucky to be in the position we are now. Back when we started thinking about climate change 30 years ago, situation was different domestically, but especially globally. that the alternatives to fossil fuels, they were a little further off on the horizon, and the world as a whole was just much poorer than it is now. And so in those 30 years, what's happened with the technologies has been absolutely stunning. The renewable energy technology itself and various industries involved with more efficient use of energy, they themselves have been stunned with how rapidly costs have come down and performance has improved. And we're just in a better position to deal with that globally, to undertake this transformation. And so one thing that can be said is that we have the technologies to save ourselves. It's not as if we are inherently dependent on fossil fuels. We have the technologies. It's still up to us to save ourselves. And so with regard to fracking itself, are we willing to save ourselves? Are we willing to make the transition? And I think it's incredibly important, as you just noted, Forrest, that these issues are politically important. And they're important to communities too. The communities that are are local to where the resource is, but it's not important to them because of a deep affinity for fracked gas or a cultural connection to the craft of fracking, and it certainly is not important to them to undertake fracking because they like the wastewater and they like the chemicals that are dumped into it. What they're interested in is jobs, and what they're interested in is investment. And we are a country now where we have the option of choosing how we invest so as to allow communities to support communities in building alternative industries. And those may be in solar, they may be in wind, or they may be in entirely different industries altogether. The reliance, like the belief that there's a reliance in exploiting this fossil fuel resource. I mean, one place that comes from is the fact that yes, fossil fuels have, in sort of a mixed way, provided an economic boost to a lot of communities, and there are some that are positively dependent on fossil fuels as it is. And so, right, historically, fossil fuels have been an engine for regional growth, but that's not a necessity. And there are other ways to grow. It's just a matter of nationally us making the commitment that we want to support these communities in growing and in creating jobs in ways that don't rely simultaneously on destroying the environment. And if the United States in particular, most powerful country in the world with a tremendous economy, is not willing to sort of blaze the trail and show how countries can choose to develop without exploiting their fossil fuels, there's pretty much no hope that poorer countries who are now seeing, oh, hey, we have some fossil fuel resources underground, that they won't also similarly exploit them. Right now, the United States is the leading producer of both oil and gas, the leading consumer of both oil and gas. And if we don't set an example of transitioning away from fossil fuels, then we really can't have very high expectations of countries that are poor, countries who haven't already achieved basic levels of energy security for their for communities. When roughly 3 billion members of the global population still don't have access to either electricity or clean cooking fuels or both. And those are not just matters of convenience. Those are, these are human rights issues. Mm-hmm. And so it's really on us to set the example, and we do have the economic and the technological resources to do so.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
If I could just build on that briefly, everything that Sivan said, and we're not here by accident. The fossil fuel industry, with its deep pockets, has created this box that there aren't alternatives being brought to the market. It really is not by accident. There's a lot of money, a lot of narrow profit motives behind this. There's enough information and research out there now around the disinformation and misinformation that the fossil fuel industry has spread and how deeply it's corrupted our political system in the United States, but also in other countries. So it's really important to peel back the layers. And the latest IPCC report in the North America chapter speaks uniquely to the United States as being a country where this kind of disinformation and misinformation has distorted the policy lens to the point that, as you all saw, the obvious thing, passing this climate bill this past summer, was dangling by a thread, and fossil fuels infected that entire political debate, including that senator who was holding us up this whole entire year and a half. Why do we get to these points when there's an obvious path forward? Is because there is a lot of money, a lot of profits being made right now off fossil fuels. And those folks want to put their interests ahead of the public interest, the collective public interest here. And breaking that connection is part of the transformative change that we need in our political system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel, very much for sharing that. And I wanted to see if you would continue on by talking more about what that people-centric approach might mean on this issue or others. You've written that a sole focus on techno-economic solutions isn't enough. We need to think about people. What does that mean in terms of people's economic realities, jobs, and how do we approach these difficult trade-offs and tensions?
Yeah, maybe I'll broaden the frame a little bit and say people and ecosystems, our planetary health as well. But the reason that we adopted this framework and the research that I just mentioned is because we had the recognition, and this is a humbling recognition, that scientific report after scientific report has been putting out these facts for decades now, and it hasn't moved the needle sufficiently on the policy front. Just today, there's a very sobering report out from the United Nations saying that countries' collective pledges under the UNFCCC framework are setting us on a path to well past 2°C temperature increase from pre-industrial levels. That would be devastating. It already is devastating at just over a degree Celsius. So we started to think about, well, what if we shifted the gaze and looked at this from the point of view of how people are experiencing this? And they are experiencing the climate crisis colliding with the energy crisis, the COVID crisis, the economic crisis, all of these things happening together. So let's think about solutions that actually create a fairer world, a safer world. And that includes really thinking about policies that cut carbon emissions, but are also helping people in their daily lives. The challenges they have with affordability around energy, the problems that they're scared about, I'll lose my job, I won't have health insurance. Those are the kinds of things that make people afraid of change. So if we can create a fair system where people can actually embrace the change, that will actually be better for all of us. And the final piece of this is thinking about the people who are not here or are very young right now, our children, our grandchildren, the generations to come. Climate change is a multi-generational problem. We are making choices today that are going to be deeply consequential for young people who are growing up today and people to come. And the problem with our markets and our political systems right now is they're extremely short-sighted. If they're thinking even in a 2-year horizon, we're lucky. And that is the kind of blinkered thinking that's not going to help us address this collective action problem that is going to affect multiple generations. So we're also thinking about, when we think about people, how can we collapse that future into now and think about it in deeply personal ways? If I'm thinking about how can I save for my kids' college education, then I need to care about in 2030 sea level rise is going to swallow up big swaths of land in many parts of the world. So what about that world that my child is going to grow up in? Thinking about those time horizons in ways that are relatable to people. And the final thing I would say is our political system is predicated on deep inequality, and that inequality is something that comes from colonial systems, from the Industrial Revolution, where an elite can keep a mass of people scared and worried about their next meal, their very livelihoods, and stifle protest, stifle the obvious fairness in the actions. And I think young people today are sick of it. That's why you're seeing this huge move towards unionizing labor, for example, just not wanting to be beholden to a system that treats you as a cog in the wheel. And I think all of this political awakening will lead to better outcomes, including for climate change, so that the well-being of people is once again centered in all of these systems that we're thinking about, the market systems, the political systems, our democracy, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Rachel. In just a couple minutes, we're going to be opening up to questions. So particularly for students here in the audience, I would encourage you to be formulating questions. And online as well, please do type your questions into the chat. Before we turn to audience questions, I was also going to ask about another type of transformation. I worked on a research project with a graduate student in Turkey related to telecommuting or remote work. So during this COVID moment, as you know, the world, much of it was working remotely. In a mega city like Istanbul, people could save 3 hours of commuting in traffic with obvious environmental implications. Do you think that there could be a transformation in whether people have to commute to work or could telecommute? Do you think that policies from governments could facilitate that kind of a transformation happening? Who would like to answer that from the panel?
I just want to say something about that, Forrest. I do think that is and could be a good idea. You know, this kind of transforming cities in this way and other ways to make life more livable, especially in big cities. The concern that I have is that in this telecommuting thing, we may lose the interaction with other people, right? The physical interaction with other people, and this interaction creates empathy, right, among people, and that is something that we really need at this point in time in this world. So this is a little bit my concern about this kind of maybe you know, it's a mix of things. The right balance for doing this, you know, the mixed approach. But that's all I want to say about your telecommuting issue.
Yes, thank you, Gabriel, for bringing up that important concerns. There might be trade-offs in telecommuting. If it, you know, contributes to a loss of community, then this needs to be balanced as well. Sivan, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, and sort of along the same lines that right. It's important to think about the trade-offs, and it's also important to think about trade-offs in terms of what are the distributional consequences. If it turns out that it's you know, it tends to be upper middle class people who are able to telecommute because their work is more based on, you know, on writing or, you know, research or things like that. But it's service sector workers who still have to plot into work. Mm-hmm. And if we, through policy, decide, okay, let's invest in broadband so more people can telecommute without simultaneously investing in mass transit or other ways of still making transit available to people who still rely on it, that would be, you know, it would be. That's exactly the type of thing we need to think about when undertaking any kind of a major policy, that there are distributional consequences. Often those who are harmed, I mean, almost as a rule, those who see the downside of it are those who are already marginalized. And so how do we make sure that policies are designed in a way that is that's being, you know, sort of acutely sensitive to the downside of the policies.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up that important point of equity in a solution that holds promise, seeing that there's a distribution of consequences as well. So thank you. With that, do we have a question from the audience? Maybe we could begin with a student question. We have some mic runners who can bring you the microphone. Okay, while you think, let's begin with a question from online. Aiden wrote a question, I'll read it. He says, besides ethics, what can motivate the large developed nations like the US to pay for their carbon emissions and resultant climate change by providing the necessary aid to smaller developing nations? So what can motivate a country like the US to be concerned with this?
I could pipe up here. I think that there are definitely important, just sort of moral considerations, ethical considerations that it would be nice to think would be an important part of the motivation. But I think, I mean, it's almost one of the reasons why I have hope that we can actually sort of mature societally to the point where we can deal with a problem like this is because it doesn't actually require us to suddenly assume sainthood. We really just need to assume a slightly more enlightened sense of self-interest. That when it comes to reducing a country's emissions, at the end of the day, any country in the world, the US, China, could force its emissions to zero tomorrow, and it won't affect how much warming they're going to see, negligibly. Because the climate change that's happening in our country, it's caused by the emissions of all those other countries out there. Yeah, we contribute something to it, but most of the emissions are not from the US. And every single country in the world can say that. Most of the emissions aren't ours. Why should we reduce our emissions? And so what that means is that a country doesn't reduce its emissions for the purpose of saving its climate. It reduces its emissions for the purpose of convincing its negotiating partners, its trading partners, its geopolitical rivals that it's doing its fair share. It's part of this game. It's willing to play, and it's willing to do what's necessary. And so taking responsibility for our own emissions is really a way not of saving, poor countries. It's a way of saving our own climate, our grandkids' climate. And then as far as providing support, additional support to poorer countries, in the climate treaty that we've signed, it's actually quite explicit about what it means to contribute to this treaty on the basis of equity, which is explicitly in the agreement. And one of the sort of clearest, homiest expressions of what equity means in the climate regime was actually from Al Gore in a editorial he wrote when he wrote, and I'll quote it here. Countries will be asked to meet different requirements based on their historical share or contribution to the problem and their relative ability to carry the burden of change. This precedent is well established in international law, and there's no other way to do it. And that's about what it comes down to. How much have you contributed to the problem, and how much can you help solve it? And it just so happens that the U.S. has contributed a tremendous amount, as Rachel already alluded to, and we, of all countries in the world, have the most potential, the most capacity, financial capacity, technological capacity to help solving it. And there are a lot of countries out there that don't have that capacity to solve it, nor do they have the responsibility, but they still need to get down to zero emissions by 2050 or whenever. And so that's kind of it's almost a fundamental conundrum, structural conundrum of the climate problem. Most of the sort of ethical responsibility for dealing with the problem lies in one set of countries, the wealthier countries. Most of the work will actually have to be done in another set of countries. It's developing countries where emissions are already higher than in the developed countries, where there are still unmet energy needs, as I mentioned, where industrialization is still happening, where urbanization is still happening, and where there's a lot of investment that needs to be made in clean energy sources. Mm-hmm. And so that fundamental conundrum, but this mismatch between sort of the ethical distribution and the distribution of the investment and work and effort, the only way to solve that is through cooperation. That's the only way to square that circle. And so, again, it's in our own interest to help poorer countries transition to sort of the global fossil-free world that we need for the purposes of stabilizing our own climate.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we have a question from the audience here? In the back.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this discussion. I'm curious what you think of the role of Bitcoin and blockchain are as a technology. Is this something that you think we're going to move away from? Or do you think that the evolution of Ethereum to proof of stake rather than mining will be worthwhile? Or is this a kind of test case for what green computing might be?
Did the panelists catch the question there?
Yes, I'm willing to venture an opinion on that, but I'm not sure I'm the most qualified of the three of us. Either of you have something that... I think for me, the most direct connection is we can't have proof of work as the basis for cryptocurrencies if they're going to keep going just because of the sheer volume of power that they've been consuming. So right, shifting to something else is good, is necessary. But blockchain has also been raised as, in terms of its potential for contributing to dealing with climate change. There's one company out there who's putting forward a blockchain technology for tracking carbon offsets and that sort of thing. But to be perfectly honest, I don't see it as being a very important player. I think that, to be perfectly honest, I think that a main motivation for blockchain technologies is a sort of, as it's referred to, a automatic trust or trust-free system for transfer, and I feel like trust among governments, among different cultures, among different people is actually pretty vital to solving the problem. And so workarounds, well, great, maybe they are needed in, certain situations, but for the most part, I think that it's more important to work to build trust and to build a sense of global cooperation and global community, because that's the only way that I see solving the problems.
Great. Thank you, Sivan. We have a question here in the front. Right down in the center front here.
Does the IPCC have a metric for measuring like the social implications of, like, in terms of environmental justice in different places? So, you guys were talking about, particularly in the US, helping marginalized communities, or like throughout the world, like, addressing energy justice. But then it's also, I think there's another aspect of, like, when we're thinking about different kinds of renewable energies or different technologies, there's a lot of extraction. And so how do you measure if there is a metric, or like how do you account for keeping companies and different people and governments accountable for these different kinds of justice along the system, like within the system of a transition, if that makes sense?
Thanks for the question. Who would like to? Gabriel or Rachel?
Yeah, so the IPCC reports, to begin with, it's really important to know they're not policy prescriptive. They're meant to be a compendium of the latest state of the science. And the way this particular issue is addressed, and Gabriel, you should jump in as well, is trying to talk about pathways to cut emissions that are aligned with sustainable development goals. And the sustainable development goals are global goals around basic human well-being indicators like health and things like that. But it is not granular to the point of thinking about specific communities that might be at the receiving end of some of these trade-offs we talked about, whether it's mining or other kinds of extractive methods. And that's why, to me, the IPCC science, it's critical. It sets a framework for our understanding, but it's never going to be enough. And taking that science and downscaling it to the point of, so what does this mean in my community? What does this mean for solutions and policy recommendations is a step beyond what the IPCC is set up to do. Again, it's a very valuable assessment of the science on a regular basis. But those kinds of policy prescriptions, it kind of stops short of going too far down that path. The other piece is that the IPCC, with every iteration, is getting better at incorporating more social science into it. It's gone from just being a very, focused on the physical sciences and drawing primarily from that literature to really expanding the lens, including in this iteration of the IPCC report, seeing indigenous knowledge really centered in talking about bodies of knowledge and experience. So I think some of these improvements over time, the IPCC is as good as the set of authors who are engaged, the underlying research, making sure it's representative of communities and countries in a way that it currently isn't quite there yet. A lot of the money and the research is concentrated in primarily northern countries. There's yet many parts of the world that haven't had the apparatus or the investment at the scale that's necessary. So I think we'll continue to see improvements on that front. At this point, it's very much, those metrics are very much around the alignment with sustainable development goals or not.
Yeah, that's correct, Rachel. Thanks for that. You can see even in the Working Group 3 report, sort of a matrix with a number of mitigation technologies and practices, and the other side, the different SDGs, right? And then the assessment of the consequences, positive or negative consequences of each mitigation option in the different SDGs is assessed based on different papers and different analysis coming from different places. So there is no metric in particular there. And there is one fundamental problem with that matrix, I have to say, and it's a critical that I'm doing to myself because I was part of that discussion, is that this kind of assessment cannot be done at the global level. A mitigation option can have positive or negative consequences, for different SDGs in different places, in different ways. So you cannot have an average for the consequences. You cannot say that this mitigation option or this technology, in average, have these consequences on this SDG. That's not possible to do. An average sort of hide the diversity, and that is unacceptable in my view.
Thank you, Gabriel. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time. Thank you to all of our panelists and for the great session here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, so thank you for your participation. It was an excellent discussion. I think that was a great question at the end there. I'll just share that there are organizations, civil society groups that do attempt to put together methods of trying to calculate what they consider to be a fair share of that carbon budget and taking into account historic responsibility, capabilities. There's the Climate Action Tracker is one method that's used for that. But these are all very much, they're normative, they're ethically based. They're not ones where, so the IPCC struggles with dealing with these where these are kind of bringing in, values of how should we do this. You can think of the UNFCCC process as at the grand scale of rather than a metric, it is one of like, let's actually bring stakeholders together and see if we can reach agreement on what is that equitable approach. The Paris Agreement is based on voluntary contributions, nations saying, here's what we're willing to do. So far, that does not match what very many people consider a fair and equitable sharing of things. Great conversation. Our next session is on just transitions. So same topic. You've been hearing through each session. I don't think we've had a session where issues of fairness, justice, equity have not been mentioned. They are core principles of this. You can't separate that from discussions of transformations, policy, action. So I hope you'll join us for that session. It begins in half an hour on just transitions, and then we have a closing session after that. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the virtual audience for hanging with us on this, and hope to see you in the next session. Thank you.
Both on the, yeah. Looks good. That looks really good. Who am I looking for? Jesus God. Here, first one here.
Neil, come over here too.